thank you everybody for attending this first webinar of our new CRWDP webinar series. We're very excited to have this opportunity to launch this webinar series. Thanks to Pam Leahy, who is coordinating this series on our behalf. And our introductory, our inaugural speaker is Dustin Galer, who was a postdoctoral fellow with the center and is currently doing a number of other pieces of work for us, including another book that he's published with the center, which is on our website. It's called Work Disability Policy in Canada, and we are presenting that book as part of our series of products that we have on our website. But today he's presenting his thesis research, which has been recently published. So take it away, Dustin. Thank you very much for being our inaugural speaker.
Thank you for those who are still with us. Just a little bit about myself. I am a historian, a PhD in history from the University of Toronto. I did a postdoctoral fellowship in the School of Health Policy and Management at York University, which looked at the relationships between poverty, activism, and disability. We did recently launch a new book with the CRWDP entitled Work Disability in Canada, Portraits of the System, which uses personal narratives to educate readers about living, working, employing, and advocating for change in work disability policy. But I spend most of my time as a business owner. I've run a business called myhistorian.ca, wherein I write corporate histories and personal biography projects of individuals and families. So that's how I spend most of my days. So this is the book that I'm talking about today, Working Towards Equity. I don't know if that's backwards there. Disability rights activism and employment in late 20th century Canada. So I think what I'll do is just kind of summarize the book, including the contents. But before I do that, I'll just tell you a bit about the main argument of the book. So this is a history book, and I argued that paid work significantly shaped the experience of disability during the late 20th century. I looked at archival records, personal collections, government publications, and conducted a series of interviews with individuals and activists living with disability. But overall, the book demonstrates how demands for greater access to paid employment stimulated the development of a new discourse of disability in Canada. In the 1960s and 70s, family advocates helped people living in institutions move out into the community, as certain professionals and others played an increasingly critical role in the lives of working age adults with disabilities. And meanwhile, civil rights activists crafted a new consumer-led vision of social and economic integration. So the main argument of the book really is that employment was and remains a central component in the efforts of people with disabilities to become productive, autonomous, and financially secure members of Canadian society. And I'm told, and I'm pretty confident in saying now, this is the first book-length history of the Canadian disability rights movement, and as such offers new in-depth analysis on rights activism as it relates to employment, shelter workshops, deinstitutionalization, and labor markets in contemporary Canada. So a few reasons about why I wrote this book. Firstly, for personal reasons. In 2002, my sister was injured in a car accident, sustained a traumatic brain injury, and it was kind of living alongside her and her experience in the hospital, her rehabilitation, and her long journey back, and transformed social status. I mean, she was a elementary school teacher before, and later, now works mainly as a volunteer worker in various institutions. So, as a primary caregiver for her, I really saw this transformed social and economic status of her, and it really woke me up to the experience of living and working with disability in this country. So that's some of the reasons why why this is a personal issue for me. Also, for about a decade, I worked as a street outreach worker in downtown Toronto, helping people living on the street get access to services and housing. And many of these people live with physical disabilities, mental health issues. And it was kind of, gaining some new friends, that learning about a lot of people living on the street, that woke me up again to the real realities of, people among our most vulnerable population living on the streets, and what it's like to live with disability. I were taught as PhD students, we need to fill a major gap in the historiography. So that was a issue for me. I needed to find something that was new and fresh, and already being turned on to the study of disability. I started to look at, what do we know about disability history in this country? And the answer at that time was very little, especially as it relates to social movement activism. And so I really started making sure that disability was a big issue in my research. And finally, again, when I started, critical disability studies was very, very young, new field in this country. And so I really wanted to be a part of that process of transforming the narrative about disability through research, making sure that traditional narrative that people with disabilities are not and do not have to be passive recipients of care and concern, but rather these dynamic actors within a social and economic context. I wanted to be part of that process. So those are some of the reasons that I wrote the book. But I think what I'll do now is just give you a kind of overview of the book, a summary, being mindful of time, chapter by chapter, so you have an idea about what the book is about, and also a bit of a reason why you should read the book at the end. So chapter 1 is a thematic chapter. We then move chronologically, but the first chapter deals with the relationship between disability, work, and identity. So this chapter introduces us to the realities of living and working with disability and considers the impact of disability activism on the ideological construction of work. This chapter reflects upon the importance of work in Canadian culture and how this feeds into the construction of individual self-identity. I draw on findings from interviews with people with disabilities to demonstrate how Canadians tend to construct their identity primarily through work and paid employment. Historically speaking, this relationship between work and identity has been strained by the fact that so many people with disabilities are unemployed, as well as different forms of disability advocacy and activism that tend to construct disability identity around concepts like need and dependence or identity politics in order to get recognition of need by policymakers. And as a result, many people with disabilities end up not really identifying with the larger disability community as such. And while I do find that there is some tension between collective and individual identity formation in the world of work, the relationship between advocacy and individual identity did find resolution in this pursuit of shared pursuit of social and economic integration. So that's the big heady first chapter. The second chapter and thereon kind of deals more chronologically. Chapter 2 introduces us to disability advocacy in the 20th century and its conceptual roots in past social reform movements of the late 19th and 20th centuries. In the 1950s and 60s, families of people with disabilities spearheaded debates about disability and inclusion on behalf of their children and adult relatives, and pushed for them to live outside residential hospitals and the sheltered spaces of family homes. Local parents groups across the country forged a national social movement to usher disabled children and adults away from a life of segregation. And these advocates were inspired by medical breakthroughs and new philosophies of community living, largely coming out of the US and UK. Organized advocacy by concerned parents and family members really did represent an important first step in the pursuit of full citizenship for people with disabilities. And I think despite its many critics, it is important to recognize that family advocates established the groundwork for the development of a new discourse of disability. They had really challenged the status quo at the time while providing concrete measures for the realization of these goals. And just for those who are visually impaired, I'm going to describe the photo that's here. This is the Marching Mothers in Toronto with donation bags in hand, led by the Chief Marching Mother, Ellen Fairclough, who was a MP during the 1950s in order to raise funds for medical research that led to the development of the polio vaccine. And this campaign, which kind of raised awareness about people living with polio and the realities of disability, led to the creation of the March of Dimes after the fundraising slogan, Just a Dime, which was and still is really a major service organization for people with disabilities. Thank you. Chapter 3 considers the role of the rehabilitation industry and awareness campaigns enacted on behalf of people with disabilities. This transition to community living ushered in by parents groups created an unprecedented demand for a range of community-based rehabilitation and social services. People with disabilities and their families held greater expectations for participation in mainstream opportunities, but people trying to access existing services were often blocked by a variety of physical and social barriers. And this in turn prompted rehabilitation professionals and other advocates to address broader social issues conventionally outside the scope of their strictly therapeutic activities. Now, rehabilitation organizations like the Canadian Rehabilitation Council for the Disabled and the CCRW, Canadian Council of, at that time called Rehabilitation Workshops, initiated massive awareness and they really became important advocates that promoted a unique vision of disability to a wider audience. Now, these organizations advocated what I think could be termed a proto-social model of disability. And it's proto because it underscored the limitations and restrictions of impairment while noting the many significant barriers caused by social attitudes and conventional responses to disability. So this approach and the ideology of disability did work towards dismantling social barriers to integration, but it also, as many critics pointed out, served to promote the interests of certain industries like rehabilitation that stood to gain from significant public and private investment. And as such, many of these campaigns about disability awareness were interpreted as advertisements, really, for the expansion of certain private and public services on the most radical end. And over time, political endorsement of these agencies did also have a tendency to insulate professional advocates from a developing grassroots movement of disability rights activists who promoted self-help consumer philosophies and a new social constructivist model of disability. Which leads us right to chapter 4, which examines the struggles of consumer activists to articulate their own vision of inclusion, have their voices heard. So this chapter really surveys the emergence of the disability rights movement in the early 1970s, which was primarily composed of disabled youth. These young folks were inspired by other contemporary civil rights movements of the time and also sort of culture of anti-authoritarianism. There was many leaders that emerged, and just some of them like Jim Dirksen, David Lepofsky, John Ray, Beryl Potter, Sam Savona, who's pictured on the cover of the book. And together these folks forged a new social movement to challenge physical and social barriers in the workplace and the larger community. Groups of disillusioned youth resisted what they perceived as a highly hegemonic or top-down rehabilitation industry and social services industry, citing their rights as citizens and consumers of public and private disability services. Disability rights activists, they asserted their own brand of identity politics, and they organized groups like People United for Self-Help that staged protests and sit-ins. They forged new coalitions within the disability community, including the forerunner to the CCD, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, and just overall carved out a new self-determined path to social and economic integration. And just a little bit about this image. This is Beryl Potter, who is president of Scarborough Action Awareness. And they're shooting a documentary. She's with the director and a cameraman. And Beryl Potter, I think there needs to be a biography written of her. She was this really dynamic key player in helping promote awareness of self-help disability rights, particularly in Toronto, but even on a national stage. So chapter 5 charts the evolution of sheltered workshops as a focal point to examine changing ideas of inclusivity and advocacy. During the 1970s, sheltered workshops evolved, taking on new forms, and they did attract a degree of political symbolism at the time, particularly among disability rights activists. Workshops were originally designed in the earlier 20th century as a way for primarily people with physical disabilities to re-enter the paid workforce through rehabilitation, occupational rehabilitation techniques. Many workshops were originally run by veterans groups and agencies like the Salvation Army and the CNIB, but the institutionalization movement of the 1970s really just totally transformed all of this. During this period, workshops increasingly focused on servicing recently deinstitutionalized people with intellectual disabilities and mental health issues. And this was part of a wider under-resourced response to the deinstitutionalization movement in Canada. Many workshops were poorly run and did not necessarily serve the interests and goals of community living that parents, activists, and others were promoting. And in the early 80s, advocates and disability rights activists and unions actually joined in a massive protest to the sheltered workshop model and the system as a whole. And this really started to undermine public support for workshops and the governments to backtrack on minimum wage exemptions, for example. And the CCRW, which is a major sponsor actually of sheltered work at the time, actually dropped the word workshops from their name, and which they're now known as the Canadian Council for Rehabilitation and Work. And so they dropped workshops from their name and they began promoting this newer concept of supported employment, which is more of a generally accepted form of supported employment now. And just a bit about the image, this is the Salvation Army Shelter Workshop on Liscar Street in Beaconsfield Village, that's in Toronto, around 1960. And many of these shelter workshops, such as this one, they did provide work to local residents with disabilities, but there was a big debate, as I mentioned, about whether they were really within the community or a part of the community, or just newer forms of institutionalization. Can you go next slide? Okay. So the final 3 chapters examine responses to disability activism by major policymakers and players in the labor market. How are we doing for time? Chapter 6 looks at the role of employers and some of the ideological constraints about disability held within the business community. So this chapter assesses the influence disability activism had on some of the policies and practices and attitudes of private and public sector employers. Employer attitudes were consistently identified in many studies as a major block in preventing disabled people from accessing paid work. And while some employers and business associations and leaders would publicly declare their support for disability issues, these pronouncements were really ultimately undermined by widespread reluctance to actually recruit people with disabilities, which showed up in the employment statistics. Employers' actions were shaped by a core set of prejudices about disability that positioned disabled job seekers as potential risks to the organization. Public sector employers did stand apart from the broader private sphere to some respect, or to some extent, by presenting themselves as models of progressive and equitable employment practices, but I mean, they certainly didn't have a perfect track record either in terms of recruitment. The introduction of new computer technologies in the 1980s, though, did lead many people at the time to believe that the labor market would achieve a sort of level playing field upon which disabled and able-bodied people could compete for employment. But, you know, this expectation really proved unfounded as many employers continue to fail to take substantial steps to employ people with disabilities. Chapter 7 considers the changing role of state agencies and policies, politics rather, within a globalizing political system. So this chapter takes a closer look at the role of the state in terms of its relationship to disability rights activism and responses within labor policy. During the 1970s and 80s, political authorities at all levels of government in Canada formulated official responses to a series of international developments in the area of disability rights. Governments established formal relations with the disability community through advisory councils and specialized bureaus like the Handicapped Employment Program, which promoted the employment and employability of people with disabilities. And many of these new bureaus and committees and provincial and federal ministers responsible for disability issues, they really function as centers of activism, or were supposed to function as centers of activism within the state apparatus, which did in turn help promote a more favorable approach to labor policy. But this system began to break up in the 1980s, and a common sense revolution in the 1990s in provincial federal politics that ultimately radically undermined public sector support of disability activism. And this was at the same time, really, that the state steadily reduced involvement in the labor market. And the image here is of wheelchair users at the public forum organized by the Ontario Advisory Council, the physically handicapped in Toronto, during Disability Awareness Week. So the final chapter considers the influence of the labor movement and ways in which limited commitment to social unionism really undermined real efforts to enact change in the workplace. In the late 1970s and 80s, organized labor endorsed the disability rights movement publicly and pursued a platform of social and economic reform. They started special coalition building projects and built bridges between disability and labor activists that really did sketch an outline for progressive change within organized labor. While labor leaders, though, were quite supportive of these types of ventures, the situation was very, very different on the ground. Many rank and file members remained quite skeptical about the impact that disability rights, including the new Charter of Rights and Freedoms, might have on collective agreements. Unions were really caught between opposing forces within the labor movement, which frustrated the acceptance of a new social model of disability. Injured workers, for example, did not always identify as persons with disabilities and thus avoided much of the ideological underpinnings of disability identity politics. And as a result, the incorporation of disability rights clauses in collective agreement happened quite slowly, as did meaningful long-term collaboration between disability and labor organizations. And just a little bit about this picture again. It is the cover of the Canadian Labour magazine published by the Canadian Labour Congress, which juxtaposes conventional symbols of disability and work. Beneath this kind of apparently handwritten caption, "There are no handicapped," sits an empty wheelchair and various work tools like a hammer and crowbar, other tools of the trade. And the message really was intended, I think, to communicate a sense of solidarity with disabled workers whose impairments prevent them from working. So, next slide. Okay, so why should anyone read this book? I think that's a valid question. I think there's many reasons people might want to read this book, but I've isolated 3 here just for a general sense. You know, unemployment in the disability community is unacceptably high and has been so for at least the past 50 years or more. We all know this. There is a very complex history, though, behind this headline that we've all heard a million times. And I think that that begs greater understanding and awareness and discourse, actually. So this book really is intended to offer an introduction to the discussion about why so many people with disabilities are unemployed and have been for so long. Secondly, I think one of the greatest gifts that history can offer us is in learning to avoid past mistakes and failed initiatives. One of my big challenges in researching and writing this book, especially from the outset, was how to write the history and frame the history of a problem that really hasn't changed very much over at least half a century. So this book really teaches readers a fundamentally important lesson to understand the history of a problem in order to move forward and not waste more time and effort on failed approaches, and many of which are documented in the book. And finally, disability and people with disabilities aren't going to disappear. And as the population ages, it's, more people will live with disability or encounter folks with disabilities. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us, not just as caregivers and advocates, researchers, policymakers, but everyone really, to have some appreciation of the history of disability and the struggles of people to achieve recognition and inclusion in Canadian society. So this book, teaches readers about the ways in which social institutions in this country and beyond have systematically defined who can and cannot participate fully in the community and based on individual abilities. And I would say it's important to understand these workings, how this happens, to avoid perpetuating them in the future.